This episode is sponsored by Assault Fitness. Assault has been a part of Power Monkey Camp for a long time. We've incorporated the runners, bikes, and rowers in our endurance sessions, as well as the competitions that we have at camp and our nightly workouts. Check out the full lineup of machines at assaultfitness.com. Welcome to the Power Monkey Podcast, where we chat with the best in the world about what they do. I'm your host, Dave Durante, with my co-host, Mike Service, and on today's episode, we have John Singleton. John has been around the CrossFit space for well over a decade. Is considered to be one of the great minds that we have within the sport. He is the founder of the Progrm, which is a training plan specifically designed for CrossFit athletes, and he has had numerous teams and individuals compete at the games over the years. Coming out of the 2023 CrossFit Games, it was great to chat with him, not only from a coach and programmer standpoint, but also from that spectator standpoint, what he liked, what his favorite workouts were, and what he thought could have been done a little bit better, and what he envisions for the future for these athletes and for this community in general. We love talking with John. We hope we can get him out to a Power Monkey camp in the near future, and we hope you enjoy this episode.
John, thank you so much for joining us on the podcast. I think, honestly, I was thinking about it. The last time that I saw you was at a vegan restaurant in Madrid with a bunch of our mutual friends out there. And I kind of missed that. So I'm looking forward to hopefully reconnecting and getting to do that again soon.
It was actually a flashback. It was a very good restaurant, actually.
Yeah, I think we were probably both skeptics going there. I think it was, I think TJ was the one that chose the restaurant to go, go meat free. And I was not super happy since Madrid has a pretty awesome meat scene. But I was glad that we weren't disappointed.
Yeah.
And so you're like we were just saying before we got kind of on the air, you should be pretty fresh after full week at the games and just an easy travel back from Madison, Wisconsin to Mallorca. So how are you feeling?
Yeah, I'm good. I think the more you travel, or the more buffers I tend to build in now. So it's like I know that going there and going back is like I used to just try and push through, whereas now I'm a bit kinder to myself. Give some buffers and make sure that I have some time to at least feel a bit more fresh.
Yeah, I can relate with that. I think Dave had an average travel back to Portland, and then I took I don't know why, the liberty to drive to the games from Ohio after flying out from Germany, and then I drove back to Ohio, and for some reason I thought it was a good idea to fly my wife to New York and drive out to New York to pick her up here. So now I'm in New York, but I can feel you on the travel.
That's quite some distances though.
Yeah,
Mike with driving, like, Mike, how far away is that? It's like 12 hours. It's like easy 12 hours. Easy 12 hours. Mike driving is like makes everyone else just like shake their head like, why are you doing this? I'm just driving to New York from Ohio this weekend. Yeah, it's no big deal. Mike, you don't have to do that. Nah, it's 12 hours in the car. It's no big deal.
Well, my relocation more or less to Europe the last few years, I feel like I can make up for it when I come back to the US. I have to get back into the driving culture and get my miles in. All right, so enough of the babble from my driving. John, we're super curious. One, we had a couple of other friends on that were coaches, and you seem to be one of the unique guys that coaches across all the like age groups, divisions, everything. So what was your status at the games? How many athletes did you have there?
So we changed our system a little in the sense like I was directly working with just one athlete. But we now have like a team of coaches who coach across the different age groups and masters and other elite athletes that we have. This year we just had two individuals and then one in the girl called Veronica in the age group, the team division.
And then the individual athlete that you work with just like really dialed in with you is Moritz, right?
Exactly. So he's because you guys are living in Germany now, no?
Yes, yeah, my wife and I are actually in Hamburg where Moritz is at.
Exactly, yeah. So he's from Hamburg as well.
Yeah, and this year, I got like a million questions. I know Dave does too, but I'll hover on Moritz for a second. So working with him individually, how often do you see him?
Quite regularly. So over the years, we've kind of done different things. We've been like a super intense route where athletes are living here full time on the island, and we're kind of like working every day. And right now we're in a bit more of a hybrid system where the athletes will come over for be it like 1 week to a month, and we'll spend that time throughout the season. And then we're also with them at every competition. I think if you put like total time from last year's games to this year's games, it is probably like 3 months or so, maybe 4 months of like in-person contact time.
And then do you have I've got again more questions on that, because that's come up a lot with like these big like team camps and places where everybody's wanting to move and train. What have you seen difference wise from when you can have somebody with you all the time versus something like that with more hybrid method?
So I think there's like the expectations versus reality. And the expectation is that, because we've run camps for years and they're super fun. The athletes, you can kind of see them progressing like step after step, even through a camp. But when you kind of switch that into living, there's lots of other dynamics that start to come in. And these are like, the basic dynamics of like friends, family, and even purpose. I think that athletes, like when you move over to Mallorca, it's a beautiful place to be, but there's no friends, no family, hard to integrate into the culture, and also a little bit of that sense of purpose. Like obviously these athletes are very driven by becoming the best athletes they can be. However, for some, they need that little bit something else. And actually, when you come to live somewhere, those things become, very apparent. And so we've found that this model of coming in for camps, not having to go somewhere and live, just works a bit better, because it's almost like they would come here for a focused period and then go home and almost have a bit of relaxation as well.
Dave, I'd love to hear kind of your perspective on that, since you were a resident at the training center. And then I definitely fell along more like this hybrid method where I would go out to the training center for a month at a time, 2 weeks at a time, contest prep. So I'm curious, Dave, any thoughts you had on that before I get into it?
Yeah, I mean, I was an athlete that lived in a location, and you're right, John, it's really difficult to be able to balance all of the other things that life is about, not being around friends and family, and it being all consuming. And some athletes manage that well, especially if you have outside activities or maybe a job that takes your mind away from you being an athlete 24/7. But what we would do is have the same thing as a national team. We would have quarterly national team camps, and every quarter the whole national team would come out to the training center, and we would, for the week, beat the hell out of each other. And it was incredibly draining physically, mentally, emotionally. And you would have to take a couple weeks off after it was done because it was such an intense few days together. And I imagine that the same thing happens with you guys. You're done with one of those training camp weeks and you're like, oh my God, like I put everything into this as an athlete, as a coach, to make sure that I'm capitalizing on the time that we have together. And when we go back home, like we're re-energized. We're like, okay, let's get back at it. But we also need a little bit of a downtime to be able to kind of reacclimate to what it's like to be on your own again.
Yeah, I can definitely see that. And actually, in a previous life, I did a lot of martial arts, and back then the system was very much live in. This was Chinese martial arts, so the culture and the system's very different. And I think that's why I was always driven to this like residency style, because that's what I lived through. And I think I do think that if you can make it work, it holds a lot of benefits. But we really struggled. I don't know if it's the nature of the sport or the aspect, but we struggled to kind of make it work permanently. Basically, that idea of permanence seemed to change the kind of nature of the living here.
I'm curious, why Mallorca? Is it because of it's a beautiful location? I mean, for you to move to more of a remote spot and then have the athletes come out to you, what was the purpose behind a move like that?
So actually, when I first came to the island, so Mallorca actually, especially in England or in Germany, has a bit of reputation as a party island, and I never really wanted to come. And anyway, I ended up coming and just fell in love with the place. It's got mountains, it's got sea, it's got kind of everything that you need. And then alongside that, especially for the games, I've always been a fan of the outdoors events, open water swimming, running, cycling, just being outdoors. And so the fact that we can do that all year round here is just a huge advantage. If I were to go back to the UK in winter, a lot of the gyms don't have heating either. And so you're just inside and you're freezing. Like you do a workout and then you're cold straight after the workout. And so we just kind of saw with the athletes that all year round you can have a more optimal training environment because it's warmer. And I think it lends really well to just kind of making those smaller steps throughout the season.
That makes sense. If you had an athlete that wanted to be full-time in Mallorca and just stay and train with you, does that mesh well with the way that you coach, or do you prefer this remote kind of hybrid method as not just from the athlete side, but the coaching perspective as well?
So I would say, like, I love in-person coaching. That's like what I love to do. However, right now we give like a hard no. We get like a few requests from athletes to come over, live on the island. And right now, we have kind of a hard no on the athletes coming over to live and train with us full time. And we're kind of, it's quite nice right now in the sense that I also get this focus period of the hands-on time with the athletes and being able to work. But then I also have a bit of a break as well. And we have another group of coaches that also work really well online. So being able to kind of mesh my enjoyment side of it and then also being supported by the other coaches, it's working well for us at the moment. I'm sure in the future we will have changes come in as well.
I mean, that resonates a lot with me. I've had a lot of different athletes, mostly weightlifting, but some CrossFit athletes too, that I'll work with remotely. And they're always wishing that we had more in-person time. And I've told them in the past, like the mixture is always really nice to work in person and then have that remote time. And the reason that I've said that is I find a lot more athlete accountability when they have to do some stuff on their own and like report back. So the amount of learning that they get from having to record a workout or offer almost like a training diary of like, here's how everything felt, versus having that, it's almost like Dave can probably relate. Like if you have a kid and they start crying and you run into the room and you take care of them, then they have this expectation and they almost can't, self-soothe. And I think in a sport like CrossFit too, you can only prepare them so much, and then they need to be able to self-soothe within a workout and like recall on like, oh, what did I tell myself in that one workout to get through it? Or what was that, piece of information that John gave me? I think sometimes, the ability to have like these little touch-up sessions in person, or like almost like in-person therapy, get through everything and then like go back and do some stuff on your own. And like you said too, maybe some even added like balance and purpose outside of the training camp and the gym model.
Yeah, I think one thing you said that I completely agree with is this kind of motivation as well, because if you know that the group's there for you at like 10 o'clock a.m. and you're kind of relying on the group to go in and do your thing each day, just being able to have to do that yourself when you're back home, I think it adds a bit of motivation. You having to push hard by yourself at home with no one else around you can develop like another aspect that's very important.
I want to switch gears a little bit and get into games. Obviously, it's still fresh in everyone's mind, and I think we mentioned this the other day on a podcast we did as a little recap, that from a spectator perspective, this was my 10th games. I've seen quite a few different iterations of it, and I thought this was a very fan-friendly games. I thought the events lent itself to very exciting finishes. Obviously, the athlete stories and what happened with Roman and so many others. It was very much emotional. Like you got very excited being in Coliseum, and I thought from my perspective, being there from a sponsor side and working with vendors, but also from a spectator side, it was very well run games. Overall, global picture from you on the coaching side and maybe athlete perspective, how did you think this game's turned out?
Yeah, I think it was really good as well. I think that So if we're kind of talking big picture, like last year, there was a lot of focus on like certain issues around the games, and we didn't have those focuses this year. Everything felt a lot smoother. It felt like everyone was kind of working towards the same direction, which has happened in previous years, but last year it didn't seem to have that same flow. So I think if you were to ask that in general the athlete experience this year, I think it would be generally positive.
Do you think the reintroduction of Castro into the mix was a positive thing this late in the game? Or if you could have let Boz just kind of run with it again after what he did last year with so many introduction of new skills and this and that, do you think it was a positive to have Castro back in the mix this late?
I think anyone who's been around in the sport for a while will tell you that they kind of, you felt the Castro presence. And Castro definitely brings like a certain energy and a certain aura around him that really is synonymous with the game. So it's nice to have that. I think there's certain discussions and places you can go on to, like, is it optimal in certain areas than others? But personally, at this year's games, it definitely brought a smile to my face seeing him walking around and doing his thing.
And from a media side, I was going to say too that like his posts were especially for the people back home, his posts during the week were some of the most informative about what was going on out of all of like CrossFit media. Like what he was saying was going on every day, and his perspective was actually really helpful as a recap every day. Like he was on point with just being in it every single day.
Yeah, his YouTube, like even pre-games,
Yeah.
then you basically have to go onto Castro's YouTube channel, and you have to listen to that to kind of get out the insights and thought processes and why the cuts are there or certain things that are going to be introduced. Actually, I chatted to him a little bit there, and one of the things I mentioned was about the no swimming at this year's games, and I was like, he was saying, I don't know, like watch my channel or media or something to find out what's going to be happening. I was like, well, you put up a picture of the waterfront and nothing was on the water. And he was like, oh yeah, I was just throwing that one in there to confuse you all. So,
Perfect. That's very Castro. Yeah.
Even though I'm not an aquatic being by any means, that was one thing I kind of missed. I liked the swimming event that they had last year, so I was looking forward maybe a swim and a max snatch or something like that, right, John?
Yeah, it's interesting. So this is you start the nuances of programming become very interesting. Obviously, I'm biased to that subject because it's what I think about all the time, and you kind of ask these questions like, if you don't test swimming, do you find the fittest? Because is swimming like an important enough aspect that you would define it in there? Let's say we took strength away or forms of strength like Olympic lifting, whatever it may be. Have you still found the fittest without testing that component, or are there other substitutes? And so there's kind of like even intellectual discussions that come off it. This year's games had no swimming. Therefore, say based on the programming, and this is a question that I asked myself, and I don't necessarily think there's any right answer. But let's say we took the last 5 years' games. Is one of the year's games programmed better than others? Is there like a better programmed year? And then why is that year better programmed?
Do you find that there's an answer there?
Yeah, that was going to be my question.
I think.
Do you find there's an answer there?
I think there should be an answer. Because I think that we should be able to go like, this was really well programmed. This was really well programmed because of this. And I think that actually would start to, that reflection process could be really useful to be like, okay, actually, because we did these things, then we were able to say that this year's programming was better. And that's an interesting thing, because at what point is the game's programming not good? At what point could we say that wasn't a programmed year? And I don't think there's enough consensus on that right now to actually have an answer. But I think it's like questions that we all should be asking to maybe find at what point does it not, like if you did win the High Rocks World Championship, could that be a well-programmed CrossFit event? And if no, why not? And then kind of work into it from that.
Those are, I think those are fun questions. I think Dave and I probably have those from time to time, and I don't want to go away from the game so much, but I am curious, John.
Wait. I want to finish on that question.
Okay,
I
don't
want to
let me
stay on that
forget
question
mine.
for a second.
Got it.
This is an interesting topic. Because one of the things Jordan and I, and actually Mike as well, have been talking a little bit more about just the 10 general physical skills and using those as kind of a baseline for creation of workouts and creation of programming for something like the games. From your mind, you know, you're fully entrenched in programming and creating these types of workouts. You've programmed for big competitions in the past. Would you ever consider using, say, instead of saying swimming as a sport is critical in trying to find the best athlete? If we don't have that, this is not a well-rounded task. Using the 10 general physical skills and saying, if we have a good programming around these 10, because a lot of times we don't see very much balance, we don't see very much accuracy. You know, there's very much, it's heavily geared towards strength, power, speed, endurance. From your perspective, would using the 10 general physical skills be a good way to be able to say, hey, this is the way we're going to program to test around the fittest, rather than saying we need a particular sport involved?
Yeah, so I believe that you have to start somewhere. So those aspects may be a great place to start. And then you kind of go, well, you know, how relevant is accuracy over strength, let's say? So then you've got, let's say we've got 12 events from the games, and one of those events heavily relied on your ability to be accurate and how we define accuracy. And then one of the events just relied on strength. Should the accuracy have more relevance over strength, and then start building it up from there? But so I do think that it can have kind of a useful relevance in starting to ask the questions of what should be tested. And, you know, and then it's like, well, what level of accuracy is it? You know, they've had like the ball toss in the past. You know, certain competitions have had shooting. Like, does one attribute itself more relevant to be accurate as well?
Dave, I was definitely trending in your direction on that with the general skills, and then how the IF3 is starting to try and come up with their, you know, ability to I guess prioritize and systemize a little bit. So there's still some variation and element of randomness, but like, you know, what areas are being tested every competition. How do you feel about that, John?
So it's a great question, because I think one of the big troubles is then you start losing the magic. So this is where everything gets a bit confused, and I think why it's hard to do. And I don't think it shouldn't be done, but I think this magic component of, you know, things are a little bit messy, you know, because when you start, so for example, in programming workouts, there was the ring muscle up one. I think it's a good example of this. 5 rounds, 7 ring muscle ups, then sandbag over the log. In this test, were you testing the athlete's ability to do ring muscle ups? I would say, because of the level of athlete that's there, actually the ring muscle ups became irrelevant in this test, because each athlete could go through unbroken, and therefore it became about moving sandbag over the log. So because of the level of athlete that you have there, you can make certain movements irrelevant in a workout. You know, I would argue that if you'd have just done sandbag over the log as, you know, for time, just remove the ring muscle ups completely, you would have probably had a very similar leaderboard as you had with the ring muscle ups. So even though you've kind of categorized that, okay, we've had some pulling gymnastics, we've had some high skill gymnastics in there, they weren't relevant, and therefore have you really tested them? And kind of coming back to this model, would it then be as exciting to see if you literally just had the sandbag over the log? Would that then be a good test of fitness because you didn't have the gymnastics in there? And so I think that these additional movements become very important when they're very important because they need to be relevant. And I think one of the troubles with the IF3 is not necessarily they've done that because they've tried, as you say, to incorporate this idea of constant change. But I think if you don't have this kind of constant variance and and the unknown and the unknowable, it will take away some of the magic from what is the CrossFit Games. And so I think you start to move from this kind of like black and white idea into this grayer area. But I think we can kind of move more further into the grey to predetermine a little bit while still keeping some of the magic. If that's with especially on this subject, like I think I could talk for hours and hours regarding this, because there are so many nuances to it, like the additional skills and these things.
Yeah, and I think they're good conversations. I think they're probably conversations that even a lot of our listeners have, with each other and in the gym. It's stuff that Dave and Jordan I talk about all the time is, how do we like a certain workout? What would be a way to make that a little bit better? We put our biases in. Of course, Dave's going to have his gymnastics bias. I'm going to have some weightlifting bias. We had a conversation the other day and everybody was asking me if I was sad that there wasn't more weightlifting. And I said, not really, because I really loved how they did the weightlifting event. Like that was a showcase event. And I think it tested a lot for the athletes. And I would definitely be curious to hear from you from a coaching perspective, how you guys warmed Moritz up for the weightlifting event. I'm pulling it into weightlifting for a little bit because I don't want to forget this.
Yeah, so Moritz is, he's like one of the most powerful athletes on the floor and big lifters. And one of the big things at the games for us becomes like managing warm-up volume. So we just don't want to do too much because, there's events before, events after, and all of these things. So we had, before the competition started, we had a rough idea of the openers that we wanted him to hit. And then in the warm-up area, we're like, okay, so how they stage it at the games is a bit different. So you start in the main athlete warm-up area, and then you have to corral. And then from there, you have to walk over to the Coliseum and then corral again. So there's kind of like two warm-up or corral times when you have to go. And so what we did in the first section was we just did empty bar to make sure that the movements were feeling good. And then the second warm-up area before the Coliseum, where you've got like 15 minutes, we built very quickly. It was kind of like 5 jumps up to his opener on the snatch, which is 125. And then, not to tire him out too much, we went into the clean and jerk, and we only built up to around 130 because we kind of felt more comfortable that he's going to have that lift. Mm-hmm. And also the difference is that you had to, after you went out, you couldn't warm up your clean and jerk anymore. It was literally heavy snatch directly into heavy clean and jerk. So that was kind of the strategy we used, kind of like 5 jumps up to open a snatch, and then probably just 3 jumps up to around 130 clean and jerk, and then he went out onto the floor.
I was impressed on so many levels. I'm curious if you were, just how all the athletes seemed to perform in that event. Like there were very few misses on first attempts. I think like in the women there might have been 1, and like in the men there might have been 2. So like the amount of downtime, and then most of the athletes, like that would have been what 125 would be like 85% lift for Moritz, something like that.
Yeah, and so we went out. So like for the American lifts, like 275 open, and when Jack's number was called, I was like, because he was the first to lift, I was like, holy moly, like I thought we were lifting big. And then Bronislav's opener came, and I was like, oh man.
Yeah, I mean the first 3 guys just threw hard on their first openers.
I was like, wow, like Morris is a good lifter. We're going to be bottom of the pack when these came out. And as you say, it's kind of testament to the athletes. Like, I think the one thing you can assure of athletes at the games, no matter what you throw at them, they're going to do pretty well, especially when it comes down to things that have been like weightlifting, for example, because it's been such a staple at the games. Like, these guys are pretty fried by that point, at the end of third day. And I was also nervous if we made the good decision on the opener just for the fatigue. I was nervous for you and all my friends that are coaching and all the athletes that I have some relationships with, because I was like, man, weightlifting as a sport is you only get 3 attempts, and it can feel very like
do or die, but you at least have this nice warm up and you can really get a vibe for how you're feeling and adjust things. But the testament to the level of technique improvement that all the athletes have had from year to year, since weightlifting became such a discipline, is impressive. And yeah, I expected, after seeing Moritz snatch, really well at regionals and knowing what kind of lifter he is, he's good. There was a blind spot for me in the clean and jerk warm up though. So to hear that you guys only hit 130 in the warm up, like, has he ever, I mean, that's almost a cold clean and jerk opener for him. Like, have you guys played with that in training where you do something else and then sort of test like a heavy, quote unquote, cold clean and jerk?
Yeah, we do sometimes. It's not something that I like to do too often, but I think it is important, because the other thing as well with the clean and jerk, he had to go out, he had to make his, so probably 5 minutes more or less between standing in the corral to being out on the floor, and then you had 4.5 minutes of wait time for every athlete to go around. So within 10 minutes he'd only hit 2 lifts through that. As opener, snatch, second snatch. And so actually the relevance of the clean and jerk warm-up would be like 15 minutes anyway. So you'd have had to wait more or less 15 minutes from a heavy clean and jerk to going out there with 2 snatches in between, which is why we decided not to hit it as well, because the time frame is so long. It's just basically as long as he's feeling okay in the positions under a relatively heavy weight, then we were kind of good to go out.
Yeah,
It was mainly based on the time between finishing the lift and being able to do the lift.
Yeah, no, definitely. And I was feeling it for maybe some of the older, more seasoned athletes, because that's the one thing I've noticed as I've got older is like snatches will still feel pretty good, but that the front rack position to kind of go in relatively cold, I was like, man, how their elbows and wrists had to have felt on that first clean. Like, thankfully, I think adrenaline in the moment can really take over. I can remember that there was a time when I was at a competition where it was a lot of really good guys all concentrated. So I had like, I did an attempt and then there was a ton of guys going until my next attempt. And I just didn't want to do something in between to tire myself out. So I had something like a 25 to 30 minute wait between clean and jerks. And I was just banking on, the adrenaline to feel good and kind of like zone it out. Was there with Moritz, or, kind of what you were experiencing with some of the other athletes? Was that any conversation?
Yeah, like, part of it becomes like, because you haven't we hadn't hit his opening weight in around a week, just over a week, something like that. So, there is, and with all the fatigues, there's definitely an element of like, we weren't sure, we were nervous. And because of his position on the leaderboard, we wanted to push the top end. So it was like one of our riskier strategies over the weekend was the numbers that he hit.
Yeah, I mean, it worked out well in the event. He did great. It was a little heartbreaking to see. I mean, 1 point, or one place out of moving on to the final day, where I think he would have wrecked the sandbag workout. That would have been really fun to watch. Yeah. But in the end of the day, on an individual side, he improved again from the year before. So my bias to the German countryman now, like, I was really proud to see it.
Can we move away from weightlifting for a second? Jeez,
I mean,
Mike.
John, you haven't been on this podcast in the past with all of our other guests, but whenever gymnastics or something comes off, Dave just completely commandeers the whole episode, and then I barely get a word in. So the fact that we could just talk a little bit of weightlifting, and for all the listeners that have been waiting for this, I hope you guys were happy to, get a little bit into the weightlifting. But I will, gladly, give to my superior now, and, we can get into some of the finer details.
Just curious from your perspective, John, what was your favorite event of the weekend?
I would actually, and there's a reasoning behind this, was Elena.
Okay. I love that workout. That was really fun to watch.
Now, the reason that I love this is actually because of the progressions that they didn't do. Because CrossFit has had a tendency to make either gymnastics more complex or weights heavier as we've gone through the years. And they could have easily done that here. Granted, bar muscle up is more complicated than a pull up, but for these athletes in that rep scheme, it again wasn't like a factor. And they just chose like, a 15, 22.5 kilo dumbbell. And the thing that I loved about that is it put the focus back on the run and just general like grit capacity. They didn't go like, hey, let's do double heavy dumbbell snatch or something, which would have taken away that aspect. I was actually quite keen to see them do normal Helen. Like from my old CrossFit days, like watching James Fitzgerald do Helen and those old school videos. That's what I kind of grew up on through my kind of CrossFit journey. And actually, I think that this is an important test of fitness, arguably like that classic CrossFit fitness that we have kind of lost a little bit. Like we don't care so much about someone's 400-meter time. But in a workout like Helen or Helena, that 400-meter time is so important. So I think that's why it was my favorite, because it was like a bit of homage to the old school CrossFit without taking it into this like other direction.
Yeah, I completely agree with you. I think that's such a great point of view on it. And again, from someone that's not going to ever go to the CrossFit Games and compete, it gave me, and I'm sure a lot of other spectators, the ability to say, I can compare myself to the athletes in this workout. I can probably do Helena with a 50-pound dumbbell. I'm not going to go as fast, but it wasn't a 70-pound, it wasn't a 100-pound dumbbell. And it gave me the ability as an athlete saying, this is a workout I want to try. I want to really see how far off I am from some of these games times too, which is always a cool thing. Be able to compare yourself and not just say, I'm going to do a scaled down version of this workout is kind of cool.
I would argue that had the most exciting finish of the females all weekend.
Oh, that was awesome.
Yeah, like, Laura was out there in front, and then, Emma Lawson was by her side wearing the leader's jersey. Then all of a sudden, like Alexis Raptis manages to get in. Laura actually struggled last bar muscle up, which opened up a gap. All happening in this last 5 seconds. And like, tip of the hat to CrossFit for this, because, this is going live on ESPN. And I think the first like live ESPN that we had was like 2015 games, where they introduced like pegboard and some other things. And it was like, I think it's a viewer experience, this kind of stuff is very exciting to watch and relatable, whereas some choices that have gone live previously on ESPN maybe weren't the best choices to promote the sport.
That's a good point, John. I think Dave and I both loved watching that one. We kept talking about it was fun to see the athletes have to push in that and very relatable. But I wasn't even thinking on the sense of that was one of the televised one on ESPN, and CrossFit can get such poor publicity sometimes as like, just doing all these, like quote unquote dumb movements or something. And that was a very pure testament of fitness. So that was a good showcase for, a general population to see CrossFit.
Well, for speaking of like dumb movements, I'm curious on your side. Well, not dumb from my perspective, just more gymnastics movements, right? And we saw just the throwing everything on the gymnastics side out there last year. I think it was 12 new movements that were introduced last year by Boz. And this year we had a bunch of new movements as well on the gymnastics side. And you look at a lot of the the trolls out there saying, it's a circus act, it's party tricks, it's this and that. A lot of times me and Mike talk about it's just people not being able to do the movements, so they bitch about it because they're not able to do a pullover or whatever else it might be. From your perspective, do you appreciate the introduction of new movements in the way that Boz and now Castro have introduced pullovers and pirouetting and those types of things, or do you think that they are more on the party trick side of things?
So I think that there's an optimal way to introduce these movements. And I think, for example, like, you give the athletes, so just a thing on this, like, so for example, you give the athletes like a week to do crossovers, and they come back and be able to do crossovers. And it will kind of like, they look good doing it and feel better. So I think in general, the introduction of new movements is important. And certain things I think are really clever and really well done. So changing Elizabeth last year to the parallel bars, I think that was just really clever addition. I think it was like having to traverse, having to do dips on parallel bars, which a lot of athletes have not done, was like excellent addition through a classic workout as well. I think this year, the addition of the traverse with the turn on the parallel bar, again, like a great addition, because it's not complex, and you've not really like, you're again setting the athletes up for success. You know, like everyone can do that. Everyone's traversed on the parallel bars. Okay, now we're adding this like next stage where you have to turn. And some athletes got it better than others, so it did factor into the workout. I think when you're just kind of thrown like a random movement, it takes away from that, like, you know, aspect of it. Like probably some athletes, as you see, you know, for whatever reason, like they were boxers or they've done different things in the past, and because of these pre-learned skills, they can just do it. Like they can just do crossovers, you know, just because they came in. No athlete kind of got the opportunity to learn on the spot how quickly they could do it. It's just some came in with that pre-existing skill. And I think when you test the pre-existing skill for testing the fittest on earth with a movement like double unders, I don't think like crossover double unders, when you introduce them in that way, I don't think that then becomes like necessarily a legitimate test. Whereas these kind of, or legitimate's maybe the wrong word, optimal, whatever it may be, but these like little additions of a traverse and then dips on a parallel bar, now with a turn and these things, I think those are very clever additions because they've not been tested by the athlete, but every athlete can do them at their opportunity.
Absolutely. So pullover would fall into that category essentially for you.
So wall walks as well.
Yeah.
I think those were both great additions.
Yeah.
There was a lot of controversy last year over the wall-facing handstand push-up.
Controversy because athletes struggle with them, not because it's a bad movement.
Yes, so this is interesting. Because of the judging standard.
Sure.
Because it became really hard to judge. Like
Yeah.
some athletes, like where does your head cross? And I think they could have made it into like a good test if they just had their head touch something to make it clear to the right athlete and judge. But I look, you know, the wall walk, changing a handstand to a wall facing, these kind of things can work really well. And you know, there's the trouble with these new movements when you introduce them straight away can sometimes be the judging. But like traverse on a parallel bar and dip, super easy. But then this like standard, because you had to cross a line, that made it really controversial because it didn't become about the test. It kind of became about the judging of the test.
Yeah, the judging is still a point of contention in a lot of these things. Just creating a uniform situation for everyone. It's probably a conversation for another time because it probably would take up a whole podcast just talking about judging and standards. And they do the best they can, obviously, but especially a judge getting thrown a new movement that they've never seen before either, and then having to figure it out, you know. So there's that whole complexity to the situation. One thing that came up, and you know, I don't know how deep you want to get into it because I'm sure you've talked about it already. But when we talk about standards and movements, the machines component of it, which I know you've had a lot to talk about leading up to the games with regards to standardization of machines and what happened with some of the runners in preparation. Do you feel like machines like that are inaccurate enough and can be calibrated to the point of actually being able to use them in that type of situation? Or would you prefer to see a swim or an outdoor run or something that we know legitimately is testing accurately?
So I think it's kind of like we have a double question. So certain machines, so one of the arguments from CrossFit side, and those who followed the whole thing regarding like the assault runners, it was basically because there is a big discrepancy across runners, and the argument is kind of that that's an acceptable discrepancy. And so for weightlifting, I believe that for a plate to be kind of qualified as being able to use in competition, it has to be calibrated something like 0.001% within its weight. And the trouble is, when you start going above and beyond that, obviously it can cause like a huge discrepancy in the total weight being on the bar and the impact that can have on the lifters, the records, all of those things. And I think a company like Concept 2 has done an excellent job in making sure that that calibration is very close towards that percentage. The trouble is with all these additional equipment companies, they've not necessarily been used for competition. And so the calibration doesn't necessarily need to be as accurate as that. And when workouts are starting to become defined by like 0.1 of a second or whatever it may be, then that becomes a huge factor in determining the outcome. So I think that, you know, that really only calibrated machines in order to give a fair test should be used, and that calibration system has to be accurate, especially when you're sending athletes to the games, and it's just not fair really to give them the luck of the lane. I do, but so just kind of finish the question. I then think, yes, in place of having like a machine, like a run, I think a lot of people, ironically, would have liked to see shuttle runs at semis. And that would have taken away all of this controversy. There's one place they could have used a shuttle run that would have maybe been interesting to see. It would have actually been at semis, and they chose to use the runner. And I think that, yeah, going from point A to B is always more exciting than watching someone sit on a machine. It's just more things going on. It makes for a better competition. And even like with the marathon row that they did, at least they had it on the screen. So the rower was moving along, so it makes it entertaining to watch. Because when an athlete, like in intervals, for example, when the athletes are sitting on the echo bike, it's not super interesting. You're just waiting for them to get off. And if there was a way, like they sometimes use these like sliding markers now, but they're kind of impossible to see. So I think that actually in competition, it's just more exciting going from A to B, or showing an easy way to move. So yeah, I think either like have like a genuinely calibrated machine, or have them move from A to B to make life easier. I also do find it funny. Like, I think CrossFit do love a part of them being controversial at certain times. Like, there's so much controversy around the sled pull as well. Oh, they kind of twice at the games. They kind of had this arm over arm aspect, and the prowler on the floor. So, you know, CrossFit, they're not afraid of controversy in that sense. And I believe that their argument is, and this is fairly public, but it's basically no matter what you throw at the fittest will emerge. And that's kind of the blanket that they use in order to say, well, it doesn't really matter that much because the fittest will emerge anyway.
Do you agree with that?
No, I don't agree with that, actually. I think it's wrong. And I think one, it gets to a point where it's kind of abusive of the athletes because you're not giving them a fair test. And secondly, I'd completely disagree because things are separated by such small margins now. I think a post actually came up saying, like, you know, if the workouts were different, we would still have these two winners. And I like, well, obviously not. You know, like, surely that's just like an obvious point. If you change, you know, if you can change the programming, and you would 100% change the winner of the games. Like, and those kind of things, when they're not seen, kind of blows my mind. Like, obviously, if you change a workout, you would change the winner of the games. You've had outliers in the past, like Tier and Matt, and arguably Rich, who have, for whatever reason, managed to kind of prove that point because they are so legitimately good. But actually, you take away those three athletes, every one of those three athletes, the programming then matters. And arguably, it's only Tier and Matt. Like, Froning is kind of more fringe. Tier and Matt have just been freaks of this generation.
Yeah, they're using almost those two as the example to prove that point. Say, well, look, if Matt and Tia can win, then it doesn't really matter what we program.
Yeah, I'm kind of coming back on one of the things we spoke about earlier. I actually posed this question to CrossFit, like the people who kind of control the games, these things. And I said, the argument is that, and this is postponed, that last year's games was well programmed to find the fittest on earth, like great test of programming. And so then I asked, was it better or worse programmed with the legless rope climbs in? Now, the thing that I found interesting here is because a huge component of alpaca were the legless rope climbs. I mean, we can see that just in the times were taken from moving from A to B, and we know that would then change the leaderboard and then change things. And so I think it's like a legitimate question, kind of referring back to this, like, what is a good definition of programming, comes back to, like, if you remove the legless rope climbs from that workout, was it then a better or worse test of fitness in order to be able to find the fittest on earth?
What response did they get? Did you get?
It was basically, you know, the Fourth Amendment, or whatever. Because there is no right answer right now. You know, we can discuss and we can debate, and people may agree with us and not agree with us, but there's no answer right now. There's no one who can sit here and tell me, arguably apart, I don't know who, could be like, that was a well-programmed CrossFit competition. If someone asked me, was that well programmed, I can give you my opinion, but I can't actually say, you know, it's just my opinion. There's nothing to say if it was well programmed or not.
Right. There's no quantifiable way to say that it tested accurately what we're looking for. There needs to be some sort of standardization around what you're actually testing for to be able to give that determination.
I think it would be like a Herculean task, but you know, something in the range of like taking the 10 physical skills, making a rubric with them, then going like in deeper on that. Like you would really need a committee of minds to put something together, but would be interesting.
Yeah, because I think if I go, okay, this year's games, 5K run, 1 RM back squats, you know, let's say 30 strict ring muscle ups for time. Is that a well programmed? Like, with that, do you find the fittest on earth?
Maybe.
Yeah, or, you know, then you take it down. We go, well, we just go for a 5K run. Do you find the fittest on earth? And it's like, it's just an interesting thought process, because at what point are you not finding the fittest on earth? And then I think at that point, you can start to ask the question of why you're not finding the fittest. And then that can lead into like, well, how do you then find the fittest?
Mm-hmm. It almost seems like it's an impossible task. The goal should be just who is the fittest at this one moment in time, you know, and aside from that, I mean, you're a programmer who sits and analyzes these things. I'm sure you putting together workouts for a competition that you've put together, you finish and say, this is a well-programmed event. And I'm proud of the workouts that I put together. This should test the most fit person at this competition.
Yes, an interesting point comes down into this, is that there's also an entertainment value. And I think that this really changes things, because you also have to think about the entertainment side. And I think that often starts to move away from, say, the fairness side of testing the competition. So there's all these other components that start to come in, of like finding the, you know, if you're kind of given a blank test of paper and asked to find the fittest, you know, like, should they have an AMRAP in there, or does that not work for entertainment side? And these little things. But you are right, it's a big task. But I do, you know, I would argue that it's a task that needs to be at least looked into, and kind of be transparent with the findings that you've gone through in order to get to a conclusion.
From a competition side of things, can you tell us a little bit about the crown and this coming back into the mix again?
So 2019, there was a big, you know, there's a lot of talk of masters, teen athletes, adaptive athletes not being unhappy when they go to the games because they don't get the focus they want. So what we wanted to do, you know, I'm really passionate about the next generation of athletes, because really they're the future of the sport. So we wanted to put on events, and we did that in 2019. And it was a lot of work, way more work than I ever imagined. I was like, you know, I don't want to do this again. But the feedback was really positive. And like the kids loved it and really motivated. So, okay, we'll put it back on next year. And then COVID happened. And so that basically shut us down for the next few years. And we had some issues with an equipment company this last year. They basically promised us that they were going to do the competition, and then they pulled out last minute. And that left us in this weird place where I was like, well, do we just cancel, or do we try and do something different with the resources that we have? And the Crown has kind of emerged from that. And it's a bit of a, we run camps all year round. So it's kind of like almost like a training camp environment, but with a focus of a competition. And the idea is still the same, to give the next generation of athletes a platform in order to be able to have something to look forward to make friends, to kind of compete together. We really tried to turn the focus away from like the winner. It was more about just having a fun time together. And, someone's accumulated points, and at the end of the competition, they are the winner. And I think we really managed to achieve that. We've got some great partners on board, like Nike really liked the concept. And so they really helped out a lot, like building this, like decorating this huge finca that we have in Mallorca to run the competition. We did events that I find fun. We like took them on bikes up a hill. We went to the beach early in the morning. And so it was just like a really fun event.
I heard one of the events, tell me if I'm wrong here, was you just took him out on a boat and dropped him out in the middle of the ocean and had to swim back to shore. Is that accurate?
Yeah, it's something I've always wanted to do, because I was like, how cool a games event would this be? Like you can almost imagine it now, like Castro just like captaining this boat out into sea and then just go like 3, 2, 1 back. So I thought it was a really cool idea. And this is the nice thing about having a small group of athletes, is it allowed us to do it. So yeah, with the help of quite a few friends on the island, we got to the port early morning, like 6 a.m., drove the athletes out on a boat, and they swam back to shore.
Wait, what was the distance on that? How far do they have to actually have to swim?
It was, it was around 750 meters. So, it was a good distance swim. Like when you're out that far at sea, like the shore looks pretty small. So
yeah.
It was really good. And, some were excited, some athletes were very nervous, but we managed to get everyone through. And I think for a lot of them that was an experience they'll remember for the rest of their lives.
I would love to see that event. That would be kind of cool to see wherever the games are being held next year, if there's a body of water nearby. Speaking of teens, I think this is an important conversation for someone like yourself that works so much with teens and puts together competitions that kind of is meant for that demographic. We've seen a lot of issues come up with athletes who are devoting so much time early on in their lives to become CrossFit athletes. This is kind of the first generation of athletes that are devoting so much time, homeschooling and leaving their families and dedicating their lives to being a CrossFit athlete. And obviously we're seeing some mental issues that come along with that, right? Some mental health issues of can we deal with the pressures of being 17, 18, 19, whatever it might be, and being able to act like an adult and be around adults while not having that same group of people around me. From your perspective, is this something that can be managed, or do we have to be a little bit more delicate with how we're dealing with these athletes?
So it's a really interesting discussion. And actually I watched there's a Netflix documentary series called Untold. I don't know if you've seen it. It's quite interesting. Not. There's a guy, I don't know if you know Inter-American football, there's a guy called Johnny Football who was like a very famous NFL player. He won the Heisman.
Johnny Manziel.
Oh, Manziel. Yeah, he played for Mike's favorite team.
My hometown team, the Browns.
Yeah, so so they did an Untold. It's a really interesting documentary series. And the thing is, with sports like American football, there's a lot more money involved and a lot more fame. So it really even exaggerates the issue a lot more than even CrossFit. But I think it's a common problem that a lot of sports face. In gymnastics, we obviously had the case of Simone Biles, who had that very public case. And I think in CrossFit, it's not something that's specific to CrossFit, but now because the sport starts to grow and athletes who've got into it from a young age, we're now starting to experience. And I think it's something that's extremely important to be able to work our way through. I mean, I don't necessarily have the answer, and I'm sure that lots of sport teams in the NFL or in gymnastics, where athletes typically start so young, it's like they must have been through this and had hopefully some ways of managing these younger athletes. And especially when like Mal and Haley this year, who are two notable athletes that kind of stepped away because of this mental pressure. I think from my perspective, I look back to when I was 18 years old and the worries and concerns that I had, and how difficult that must be for, when you've almost got the pressure of the sport on you to do well. It's like every time you step out onto that competition floor, it's like the intensity of that emotion must be extremely strong. And I think it's something we have to be very cautious about. And that's one of the reasons for the Crown is like, we want to I think competition can be fun, and we want to try and make it fun, not just stay away from the competitive aspect. But some way of like knowing that, just because you don't win a competition or you don't do well in a workout, it's not the be all and end all of life. Like life still continues. And actually, I think, the fact that it's a great opportunity for them to be able to make a whole lifestyle from it. And if they can do that in a positive, healthy way and actually work through some of those issues, it would be great for them as well as the sport.
Yeah, I think one of the things you mentioned that I think is important to note is that this is not unique to CrossFit. It's every sport deals with the same thing. We've seen it in gymnastics forever, especially where you're at the peak of your sport while you're still a teenager is unique. So it just happens to be that Mal is young and incredible. And so gymnastics is also unique in that sense where we have teenagers who are at the peak of the sport, or it had been up until a short period of time ago. But what, I feel like maybe Olympic sports have had, don't get me wrong, we have a long way to go to be able to solve this problem, to be able to put more things in place to be able to take care of these athletes. But there are more mentorship programs. There are more, the NCAA program has allowed for an outlet for that, right? So I have a place to go to continue where I'm still around people of my own age that are all doing the same thing. I think one of the challenges where you take a teenager and put them into a bunch of adults who have different problems, different life things that they're going through, and there's supposed to be this connection between a 17-year-old and a 30-year-old, and there's a complete disconnect in terms of life experience, and that person has no one to be able to connect with and to be able to go home and say, hey, I should be at my prom right now, or I should be, at a high school football game, and I'm with a family that's, trying to put their kid down for bed. And it's a huge disconnect in terms of where people are in their lives. So the collegiate atmosphere has allowed these athletes who have struggled to be able to be around people who are like them. And so, to me, you need support systems in place that allow the athletes at that age to be able to feel like they are that age and not to have to feel like they've grown up in an instant.
I think that's it's really interesting to hear, and not something that I'd heard. And I think it's really hard to draw correlations from small numbers. But with Haley and Mao, we both know that they both moved away to different training camps at a young age. And the one example we have who's also at a young age is Emma Lawson, who decided to stay at home, go to prom, and live that life. And it's not that those kind of stories obviously fit very well with that model.
Sure.
We noticed that with Veronica, for example. We have two other games athletes, but Moritz is only like 27, but to Veronica, that's like a whole different life away, which is why we encouraged her to come over with her friend, because as you say, you can relate better to someone who's 17-year-old, and even though it's a 10-year difference, which, as you get older, feels very, to me now, the 10-year difference doesn't feel very much. But if I take myself back into a mindset, you never thought you were going to reach 27 years old. It felt like you'd be super old when you got to 27. So that's a really interesting point. And I think something, people who are working with young athletes, definitely something that should be looked into.
I think, John, you made a good note there too, with kind of comparing Mal and Haley and Emma's. I think we can be really quick too in sport and CrossFit and life to go like, oh, if it happened, there was a cause for it, like not that it was correlated a little bit. So like, you know, Emma being successful at this point and deciding to stay home and do her things, like that's working for her. And, you know, Mal and Haley were phenomenal and still are, and they did their thing. And there's probably a little bit of both. Like some of it is added to a cause, and some of it is just like it's still pretty random because it's such a small population size and small sample size to really look at. But at least at this point, which is cool, is the conversation is out there now. So like there's an awareness, and everybody can be a little bit more alerted to how can we put some things in place, some support, the connections, and just being willing to adapt.
Yeah, I think that's a very good point, that these two, Haley and Mal, have really brought the awareness, and the fact it happened in the same year, I think, has made all coaches should be very conscious of this now. Whereas before these examples happened, it's like actually maybe maybe we weren't as aware as we should be of these things.
Well, I think the crown is probably a great step in the right direction to give these athletes a place where they can compete and enjoy themselves and be around athletes who are very much like them, not only age-wise, but mentality-wise as well. When is what are the dates for the next one?
Yeah, so the finals will be happening during Easter 2024, and then we're going to be holding the qualifiers. So this year we're opening up 4 spots for under 20-year-old, 2 male, 2 female, and they'll be held around November time.
Fantastic. Well, John, appreciate the time today. Always great to have some insight into the back ends of what's happening as a coach. The games were very exciting, and we're excited to see what happens next. We'd love to be able to meet up with you in person. Before we get you out of here, are you cool to answer a couple of quick questions for us?
Yeah, of course.
All right. First one, what sport or discipline do you prefer, weightlifting or gymnastics?
Gymnastics.
Yes. See that, Mike?
that was way too quick of an answer, John. I don't mind the answer, but like the level of speed that you answered, there wasn't even a contemplation.
If I had stronger legs, I'd be with you.
All right, I'll take that. We just have to start spending more time together, and get on the squat bandwagon.
I love it. How tall are you too, John? You're a tall gymnast, aren't you?
I'm like 6'2", so
Yes, that's what I'm talking about. Big guys doing gymnastics. That's what we need more of. Mike, not so happy right now. Love it.
Yeah,
Number 2.
I'm just being quiet now. I'm hurt.
Number 2, anyone that you think would be great for us to have on the podcast, somebody that you've come across recently or that you work with, that would be a good interview.
I think obviously, as we are interested, I'm very interested in the sport of CrossFit. I think getting an extra perspective, actually, Dana White from the UFC would be really interesting. I'm not sure if you can get him, but
that would be nice. Are you a UFC fan yourself?
Not hugely. I follow, but I'm not very in depth. Like CrossFit's really the only sport I'm very in depth in. But I think what they've managed to reach the masses, and I think CrossFit has that ability as well. And so I think just speaking to someone who's been through that process would be really interesting.
When we talk about entertainment, they've kind of cracked the code on sport entertainment more than others have. Yeah,
exactly.
And for whatever reason, the Paul brothers seem to have done the same thing with what they've done. A lot of rolling of the eyes here, but I mean, you got to give it up for those guys. They're even pulling the UFC fighters in there to get a paycheck, And
I think one thing they managed to do really well is transition across different markets. I mean, one started out on like Disney Plus, and then they started a different channel, and now you're right. Somehow they've managed to move into like sports, and arguably boxing is one of the hardest sports to kind of move into and build a name for yourself, and they somehow have managed to do that.
And Jordan, I see you rolling your eyes over there, but I mean, we have Tyson Fury going to be fighting Francis Ngannou pretty soon. Do you not want to see that fight? I mean, that's like 2 of the most impressive people out there. It's going to be a pretty badass fight.
It's going to be an awesome fight. I mean, what I'm just rolling my eyes at is just the way that the Paul brothers act. Like that's
sure.
It's annoying. Like you can be great, and they are good athletes. I mean, there's no question about it. They're good strikers. They're good athletes. Just don't be a knob in the process,
Man, Jordan's
That's
throwing
part of the personality.
grenades.
You gotta have heroes and
That's how
villains, man.
that's how they get. I mean, it's a whole persona. That's
Yeah,
how
I
you
mean
get the views. I
they
get where they're
probably
coming from. It's just not my style.
We actually had this debate at the games with some of the coaches about actually how CrossFit's a really nice sport to be in the sense that there's no hero and villain. I mean, I think Daniel Brandon became like a villain, and she didn't really do anything wrong, you know. But it was like she was the villain because everyone else is so nice.
Yeah, do you think that's necessary? It almost felt like Matt for a while was like trying to be a villain, but it's just not possible. Everybody's just too kind to each other. Somebody finishes, Jeff is out there on the floor cheering Roman on to finish the event. Just everybody just wants each other to do well.
Maybe it's not needed. I think it has just been the classic model, like McGregor, for example, was like, someone who's driven huge amount of views because he was just controversial. I don't know. That's why we need Dana to answer the question.
Yeah.
I mean, I'm gonna stay on the positive side though. I like, CrossFit and kindness, the hope for humanity. So you don't have to have a villain. We can all be superheroes.
Mike is so sweet. There you go. Yeah. Last one here. If you were a book reader, any book that you've read recently worth checking into? If not, TV show or movie that you've seen recently?
I did mention, so I always listen. I'm like an audiobook listener. I'm always really bad at written down. But I have been quite enjoyed this Untold Netflix documentary series.
Okay.
It's interesting. The reason is it's like athletes who are kind of on the verge of success, but then these other factors played in. So it's just interesting, and it all comes firsthand. So it's not just people talking about them, but the athletes going into the stories themselves. And I think that's really it can be insightful and just kind of opens your eyes a little bit to some of the things that can happen.
John, Dave and I recently terminated both of our Netflix accounts. So maybe after we go off the air, you could share your login credentials with us so we can hop on that.
Post it publicly.
There we go.
The other one that was on Netflix we've talked about when it first came out that kind of hits a similar tone. It's The Weight of Gold. The one that basically, Michael Phelps, Paulo Ono, a lot of these other very high profile Olympic athletes talking about what happens when you hit post-career and you're no longer defined as an athlete. It's a little bit of a different thing to think about, but kind of falls in line with this mentality of athlete and success and what happens when that's over.
Yeah, a whole nother topic of like actually when athletes retire, like especially in the sport of CrossFit, you have not made enough to be financially safe for the rest of your life. I mean, maybe there's one or two now, but the large majority of athletes, 99%, what do they do when they retire? And I think that's a very interesting discussion to go into as well.
Yeah. I was just on the Jedberg podcast. One of those, the Army sponsors, and it was a big part of the conversation because Olympic athletes and military deal with the same thing. It's very similar post-career. I was defined as athlete, as soldier. I don't have the bank account that maybe a Johnny Manziel has to be able to at least give me some runway post-career. So those athletes are a little bit more in an interesting situation, not having a bank account to allow some time to figure things out. But it is a discussion for another time, but definitely one that's worth having. John, thank you for the time, my man. Where can people find you? Where can they follow up with you if they want to get a little bit more information on what you got going on?
Yeah, they can. The easiest place is on. So we have a social media account, which is at the Progrm without an A, and that usually keeps all like up to date on athletes and us and what we're doing. And hopefully we can come over to you guys as well. Like I really want to be able to get over to a camp sometime in the near future.
Whenever you want, man. We'd love to have you there. It's a pretty kick-ass event. I know the listeners are probably sick of hearing it, but we have our 10-year anniversary coming at the end of September, our 20th camp, and then our fall camp, our spring camp, end of April, beginning of May, will be the 21. So if you have some time in 2024, we'd love to have you out with us.
Yeah, 100%. Like it looks so fun, and it's definitely on like the bucket list to get out and come to one.
Make it happen, man. You got a bed waiting for you. Mike, anything else you want to add there?
I mean, I do have to apologize to John. I was really wanting him to come out to camp, and then as I was telling him how great and how much we want him out there, I was like, oh, but this one's full. So we got to wait till 2024.
Good problems to have.
Yeah, so he's got his golden ticket from me too for 2024, even if he has to take my bed.
Plenty of space. Thanks again, John. We appreciate the time. For all the listeners out there, please be sure to head over to powermonkeyfitness.com for services and upcoming events. Check out our Instagram pages for regular teaching and technical content at Power Monkey Fitness, at Dave Durante, and at Mike Service. On behalf of Power Monkey Fitness, we're your hosts. I'm Dave Durante with my co-host Mike Service. And until next time, thank you all for listening.